You really think you can start that thing, old man? The laughter came fast, sharp, and confident, rolling across the concrete like it belonged there. Captain Ethan Brooks stood with his arms crossed beside the silent A-10 Thunderbolt II, the morning sun reflecting off his sunglasses. Around him, a cluster of maintainers and airmen exchanged amused looks, grateful for a distraction from a problem that had already stolen most of their day. The aircraft sat motionless on the flight line, its gray fuselage glowing under the South Carolina heat, its twin engines as quiet as stone. For nearly 7 hours, teams of specialists had inspected every system they could access. Laptops had been connected, diagnostic programs had been run, checklists had been reviewed and reviewed again. Every screen insisted the aircraft should be operational. Yet the A-10 remained stubbornly silent. A few yards away stood Walter Hayes, 82 years old, white hair, faded olive jacket, weathered hands resting loosely at his sides. He looked less like a man standing on an active Air Force base and more like someone who had wandered over from a hardware store parking lot. He didn't answer the captain's question. He didn't react to the laughter either. Instead, his pale blue eyes remained fixed on the aircraft. Not on the nose, not on the cockpit, somewhere farther back, somewhere only he seemed interested in. Captain Brooks smirked. That's what I thought. More laughter followed. A young staff sergeant shook his head. Sir, maybe he's waiting for the engine fairy. That earned another round of chuckles. Walter remained silent. The captain took a few steps closer. You know, my grandfather used to tell stories about mechanics from your generation. Wrenches, duct tape, and luck. Things have changed. He gestured toward the maintenance trucks, the diagnostic stations, the rows of modern equipment parked nearby. This isn't 1975 anymore. The old veteran finally blinked. Nothing else. No argument. No defense. No irritation. Just a slow blink before his gaze drifted back to the aircraft. Somehow that calm seemed to annoy the captain more than any response could have. The wind shifted across the runway. Heat shimmered above the tarmac. In the distance, another aircraft climbed into the bright blue sky, its roar fading into the morning. Walter watched the silent A-10 as if listening to something nobody else could hear. Captain Brooks followed his gaze. Let me guess. You're about to tell us she's talking to you. A few airmen laughed again. One of them pulled out his phone. Another leaned against a maintenance cart, eager to watch whatever happened next. Walter finally spoke. His voice was low and rough from age. No. The laughter faded. The single word carried unexpected weight. The captain raised an eyebrow. No. Walter nodded once. His eyes never left the aircraft. She's trying to tell you what's wrong. For a moment nobody said anything. Then the captain laughed harder than before. The others joined him. The sound echoed across the flight line while the old veteran stood perfectly still beside the silent aircraft, watching it with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime listening when everyone else was too busy talking. Captain Ethan Brooks shook his head as the last traces of laughter faded into the humid morning air. He had expected irritation, maybe an argument, but the old man's calm confidence unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Around them, the flight line remained locked in the same frustrating reality it had been trapped in since dawn. The aircraft sat motionless beneath a cloudless sky. Maintenance trucks were parked nearby. Toolboxes stood open. Extension cables stretched across the concrete. Everywhere there was evidence of effort. Everywhere except results. A crew chief climbed down from a maintenance stand and wiped sweat from his forehead. Sir, we just completed another diagnostic sweep. Brooks turned immediately, and the crew chief hesitated. Same results as before. No faults detected. A few groans came from the technicians gathered near the aircraft. One airman kicked lightly at a rubber wool chock before catching himself. Nobody wanted to be the person blamed for a problem that seemed impossible to find. Brooks folded his arms tighter across his chest. Run it again. That will be the 4th time. Then make it the 5th. The crew chief nodded and headed back toward the equipment cart. Walter Hayes remained exactly where he was, motionless, watching. The old veteran's attention never wandered. He studied the aircraft with an intensity that seemed completely disconnected from the activity around him. His eyes moved slowly across the fuselage, the wings, the landing gear, the engine nacelles, then back again, not searching, remembering. A warm breeze crossed the runway and carried the faint smell of jet fuel through the air. Somewhere in the distance, A transport aircraft taxied toward another section of the base. The familiar sounds blended into the background like distant waves. Walter barely noticed them. Something else held his focus. A young airman named Jake Foster noticed it first. He had been helping with the diagnostic equipment all morning. Unlike the others, he had stopped laughing. He followed the old veteran's gaze and watched him study the aircraft. There was something unusual about the way he looked at it. Not like a visitor admiring a military display. Not like a retired mechanic reminiscing about old days. It felt personal. Jake could not explain why. Captain Brooks noticed the silence and turned back toward Walter. "All right," he said. "You seem to know something nobody else does." Walter finally looked at him. "Maybe." A few technicians exchanged glances. Brooks let out a short laugh. "Maybe." Walter nodded. "Depends on whether anybody wants to listen." The captain smirked. "We have engineers. We have specialists. We have technical manuals thicker than phone books. What exactly do you have?" Walter's expression never changed. His eyes drifted back toward the aircraft. A long moment passed before he answered. 40 years of listening to airplanes. The response earned another round of amused smiles from the crowd, but Jake Foster did not laugh. His attention had shifted to a small section near the rear of the aircraft, the same area Walter kept watching. The old veteran slowly lifted one weathered hand and pointed toward it. "Tell me something," he said quietly. "Who replaced Panel 7? For the first time all morning, the flight line grew noticeably quieter. The question seemed simple enough, yet nobody answered it immediately. Captain Brooks glanced toward the maintenance crew. Several technicians looked at each other. One shrugged. Another frowned as if trying to remember. Finally, a senior mechanic stepped forward. "Panel 7 was replaced 3 weeks ago during scheduled maintenance." Walter nodded slowly. "Who signed off on it?" The mechanic looked confused. "Why does that matter?" Walter did not answer. His eyes remained fixed on the aircraft. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Captain Brooks exhaled through his nose. Because apparently the airplane is talking to him. A few people chuckled, but the laughter sounded weaker now. The old veteran had managed to plant a seed of doubt where confidence used to be. The mechanic pulled out a tablet and opened the maintenance log. The bright screen reflected in his safety glasses as he scrolled through several records. "Looks like it was contracted work. Outside team." Walter nodded again. "Thought so." Brooks raised an eyebrow. "You figured that out by staring at it?" Walter finally turned toward him. "No." His weathered hand lifted slightly toward the aircraft. "I figured it out because whoever installed it did not know her." The captain folded his arms. "Her again." Walter ignored the comment. The warm breeze shifted across the runway. Sunlight flashed against the aircraft's canopy. In the distance, Jake Foster watched carefully. Something about the old man's confidence felt different from arrogance. He was not guessing. He was not trying to impress anyone. He sounded like someone describing an old friend. Walter took several slow steps forward. Nobody stopped him. The technicians exchanged uncertain looks as he approached the aircraft. He moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had spent decades around machines that demanded patience. Every few feet, he paused and studied another detail. A panel edge, a seam line, a fastener. Tiny things most people never noticed. The maintenance crews watched in silence. The old veteran stopped beneath the left engine nacelle and looked upward. His pale blue eyes narrowed slightly. Jake followed his gaze. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed Walter focusing on the same section again. A small area near the rear access panel. Nothing looked damaged. Nothing looked loose. Everything appeared perfect. Too perfect. Walter stepped back. "That panel does not belong there." Several technicians immediately objected. "That is impossible. It is factory certified. Every measurement passed inspection." Walter listened without reacting. Captain Brooks spread his hands. "There you go. Mystery solved." The old veteran remained calm. "No. The mystery just started." The confidence in his voice caused the crowd to fall silent again. Jake felt a strange sensation settle in his stomach. He had spent years around aircraft and maintenance crews. He knew what uncertainty looked like. Right now, the old veteran was the only person on the flight line who did not seem uncertain. Walter studied the aircraft one final time before speaking. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Tell me something. Has anyone actually looked behind Panel 7? Or did they just trust what the computer told them?" The question hung in the air like heat above the runway. Several technicians shifted uncomfortably. One glanced toward another, silently hoping somebody else would answer first. Finally, the senior mechanic cleared his throat. We did not remove it. Walter nodded as if he had expected exactly that response. Of course you did not. Captain Brooks rubbed a hand across his jaw. His patience was beginning to wear thin. Let me get this straight. You think an entire maintenance team missed something because we trusted our equipment? Walter looked at him calmly. I think good people trusted the wrong thing. The captain laughed once. It was not a happy laugh. These systems are designed by engineers. They are tested by engineers. They are approved by engineers. Exactly, Walter replied. And every one of them assumes the installation was done correctly. The words landed harder than anyone expected. Nobody spoke. The old veteran slowly reached into the pocket of his faded jacket. Several people watched with curiosity as he removed a small leather pouch darkened by decades of use. The leather was cracked. The stitching had faded. One corner carried a black scorch mark that looked almost as old as the pouch itself. Captain Brooks smirked. What is that supposed to be? Walter ran a thumb across the worn surface. For a moment he did not answer. His eyes rested on the old pouch as though it carried memories heavier than its weight. Something that saved me a lot of trouble once. A few airmen exchanged amused glances. One whispered that it looked older than the aircraft. Another suggested it belonged in a museum. Walter ignored them. He carefully opened the brass snap and looked inside. The movement was simple, but something changed in his expression. The flight lines seemed to disappear from his eyes. The noise faded. The sunlight faded. For an instant, he was somewhere else entirely. The smell of hot concrete became the smell of rain. The distant hum of aircraft became the familiar rhythm of engines working against impossible odds. A younger version of himself stood beneath gray skies beside another aircraft. Hands covered in grease. Uniforms soaked from weather. Listening. Always listening. Not to computers. Not to screens. To the machine itself. The memory flickered and vanished. Walter blinked once and returned to the present. The crowd never noticed the shift. Only Jake Foster saw it. Only Jake noticed the distant look in the old man's eyes and the strange respect with which he handled the pouch. Sir, Jake said carefully, what is inside? Walter looked at him. The question carried no sarcasm, no challenge, just curiosity. That alone set the young airman apart from everyone else standing there. Walter reached into the pouch and withdrew a small metal tool. It was nothing impressive. No polished finish. No advanced electronics. Just a simple hand tool worn smooth by decades of use. Captain Brooks stared at it and laughed. That is your solution? Walter closed the pouch and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he turned toward the silent aircraft once more. His voice remained calm. No. His eyes settled on panel 7. That is how I learned the answer 40 years ago. The old tool rested quietly in Walter's hand, unimpressive to everyone except the man holding it. Captain Brooks looked from the tool to the aircraft and shook his head. 40 years ago, he said. That thing probably belongs in a display case. Several technicians laughed. Walter did not. His eyes remained fixed on the aircraft as though the conversation happening around him barely existed. The wind tugged gently at his faded jacket. Somewhere beyond the runway, a transport aircraft climbed into the bright afternoon sky, its distant rumble fading into the heat. Walter turned the tool over once in his palm. The worn metal reflected a thin line of sunlight. This was not special, he said quietly. Back then, nobody thought it was special. Jake Foster found himself stepping closer. The young airman could not explain why, but he wanted to hear more. Something about the old veteran's voice carried the weight of experience rather than nostalgia. Walter looked toward the aircraft again. There was a time when people trusted their eyes before they trusted screens. Captain Brooks smirked. And there was a time when people used maps instead of satellites. Walter nodded. Sometimes the map still works. The answer drew a few chuckles, but less than before. The mood on the flight line had shifted. The confidence that had filled the morning was beginning to crack beneath the pressure of failure. 7 hours without answers could do that to people. Walter slipped the tool back into the leather pouch and carefully closed the brass snap. His fingers lingered on the scorched corner. For a moment his expression softened. The years seemed to peel away from his face. He remembered standing beneath another sky, another flight line, another aircraft that refused to cooperate, while a schedule slipped further behind. Younger voices, younger faces, the same frustration, the same certainty that technology should have all the answers. Yet the memory that stayed with him was not the machine. It was the lesson. Machines lied sometimes. Not because they were broken, but because people assumed they were right. The memory faded. Walter looked up. Has anyone checked the mounting alignment behind the panel? A technician frowned. The diagnostics did not indicate a problem. Walter nodded. That is not what I asked. Silence followed. The technician glanced toward another maintainer. Neither answered. Jake noticed it immediately. Nobody actually knew. They had trusted the reports, trusted the software, trusted the inspection records. But nobody had physically checked the area since the replacement. Captain Brooks noticed the hesitation too. His expression tightened. You are telling me an entire maintenance section missed something that simple? Nobody responded. The heat seemed heavier now. The aircraft sat motionless in the sunlight, silent and patient. Walter studied it for several seconds before speaking again. His voice was calm, almost gentle. I am telling you that airplanes do not care about paperwork. The words settled over the group like a blanket of uncomfortable truth. Jake glanced toward the maintenance logs on the nearby tablet. An idea formed in his mind. If the old veteran was right, there had to be a record somewhere. A name, a contractor, a report, something. He quietly stepped away from the crowd and pulled out his phone. Behind him, Walter continued staring at the aircraft. Not like a stranger, not like a visitor, like someone looking at a friend he had not seen in a very long time. Jake Foster moved farther down the flight line until the voices behind him faded beneath the distant sounds of aircraft operations. He stopped beside a maintenance cart and opened the digital records system on his phone. At first, he expected to find nothing. Just another routine maintenance entry buried among thousands of others. Instead, the deeper he searched, the stranger the story became. The replacement work on Panel 7 had been completed by an outside contractor. That part was normal. The approval chain was not. Jake scrolled through the documents again. Then a third time. His pulse quickened. Several records attached to the aircraft had restricted access markers far above anything normally associated with routine maintenance. He looked back toward the silent aircraft. Walter Hayes still stood beside it. Still watching. Still waiting. The old veteran had not moved. Jake opened another file. A maintenance history archive stretching back decades appeared on the screen. Most aircraft accumulated hundreds of entries over time. This one carried thousands. Inspection reports, engine replacements, structural upgrades, modernization programs, decades of service. Jake continued scrolling until one detail made him stop. A designation appeared repeatedly throughout the archive. The same aircraft serial number, the same tail number, the same airframe. His eyes widened. The aircraft sitting on the runway was far older than most people realized. Piece by piece it had been upgraded and rebuilt through the years, but underneath all the changes it was still the same machine. Jake felt a chill despite the heat. He opened one of the oldest surviving records. The document had been scanned from paper decades earlier. Most of the text was faded. Several names were barely readable. One name was crystal clear. Walter Hayes. Jake stared at the screen. The old veteran's name appeared again in another report. Then another. Then another. Crew Chief Walter Hayes. Senior Maintenance Specialist Walter Hayes. Emergency Recovery Lead Walter Hayes. The entries spanned years. His involvement was everywhere. Jake looked up from the phone. Suddenly, the way Walter stared at the aircraft made perfect sense. This was not just another airplane to him. The realization settled heavily in Jake's chest. He returned to the records and opened a final document. The file loaded slowly. When it finally appeared, a note attached to the aircraft's history caught his attention. The document referenced an incident decades earlier involving a severe mechanical failure during an operational deployment. The aircraft had been scheduled for permanent retirement afterward. Yet another line followed beneath it. Airframe preserved following direct recommendation from senior command due to extraordinary maintenance actions performed by Crew Chief Walter Hayes. Jake blinked. He read the sentence twice to make sure he had not imagined it. Around him, the afternoon sun reflected off concrete and aluminum. Behind him, laughter had disappeared from the flight line. Nobody was laughing anymore. Jake looked toward Walter once again. The old veteran remained calm, almost detached, as if none of this mattered. But now Jake knew something nobody else standing there knew. The aircraft had not simply crossed paths with Walter Hayes decades ago. Its entire history had been shaped by him. And for the first time all day, Jake found himself wondering whether the old veteran already knew exactly what was wrong with it. Jake stared at the screen for several long seconds before finally moving. The afternoon heat pressed down on the flight line, but he barely noticed it. His attention remained locked on the maintenance records. Walter Hayes was not simply connected to the aircraft. He was woven into its history. Every major chapter seemed to carry his name somewhere in the margins. Jake felt a growing sense of urgency. This was no longer about a stubborn maintenance issue. Something much bigger was sitting in plain sight, and nobody else seemed aware of it. He quickly searched for the command contact attached to the aircraft's historical archive. Most of the names listed were retired, reassigned, or no longer active. One remained: Colonel Richard Callahan. Jake recognized the name immediately. Everyone on base did. He was scheduled to oversee the demonstration flight later that afternoon. Jake hesitated. Calling directly up the chain without orders was a fast way to create problems. He looked back toward the aircraft. Captain Brooks was still standing near Walter. The discussion had become quieter now. Less mocking. More defensive. Nobody had answers. Walter still looked like the only person on the flight line who was not frustrated. Jake made his decision. He opened the contact directory and placed the call. The phone rang once. Twice. Then a calm voice answered. Colonel Callahan's office. Jake swallowed. This is Airman First Class Jake Foster. I apologize for calling directly, but I believe there is information regarding Aircraft 017 that needs immediate attention. There was a pause. What kind of information? Jake glanced at the records again. Historical maintenance records, ma'am. Another pause followed. Hold. The line went silent. Jake could hear his own heartbeat. A warm gust swept across the runway. Somewhere behind him, a tow vehicle beeped while reversing. The ordinary sounds of the base suddenly felt distant. Then a different voice came onto the line. Calm, direct, experienced. This is Colonel Callahan. Jake straightened instinctively, even though nobody could see him. Sir. The colonel waited. Jake took a breath and explained everything. The maintenance records. The repeated references. The connection between Walter Hayes and the aircraft. The unusual archive notes. The recommendation preserving the airframe decades earlier. Silence followed. Not confusion. Not skepticism. Silence. Jake looked toward the runway again. Sir. When Colonel Callahan finally spoke, his voice had changed. The calm professionalism remained, but something else was underneath it now. Recognition. Did you say Walter Hayes? Jake blinked. Yes, sir. Another silence. Longer this time. Then came a question Jake did not expect. Is he standing beside the aircraft right now? Yes, sir. The response came immediately. Do not let him leave. The line went dead. Jake lowered the phone slowly. A strange feeling settled over him. The colonel had not asked for verification. He had not questioned the records. He had not requested a report. He had only asked one thing. Is he standing beside the aircraft right now? Across the flight line, Walter Hayes remained exactly where he had been all afternoon. The old veteran stood beneath the bright Carolina sun with his hands resting at his sides, quietly studying the aircraft while everyone around him searched for answers. What Jake did not know was that nearly a mile away, Colonel Richard Callahan had already pushed back from his desk and was moving faster than anyone in headquarters had ever seen him move. The atmosphere on the flight line changed long before anyone understood why. Captain Brooks noticed it first. Conversations were becoming shorter. Technicians who had spent the morning defending their conclusions were now checking and rechecking their work. Confidence was quietly giving way to uncertainty. Walter Hayes remained calm through it all. The old veteran stood beside the aircraft with the same patient expression he had worn since arriving. He never asked for attention. He never demanded authority. He simply waited. A maintenance supervisor finally approached him. If you believe the problem is behind Panel 7, why not just tell us what it is? Walter looked toward the aircraft. Because I have not seen it yet. The supervisor frowned. Then how can you be sure? Walter's eyes settled on the panel. Because she is behaving exactly the same way she did before. The answer raised more questions than it solved. Before anyone could ask another, the distant sound of tires crossing concrete echoed across the runway. Heads turned. A black staff vehicle was moving toward the flight line much faster than vehicles normally moved inside the maintenance area. Several airmen exchanged confused looks. Captain Brooks narrowed his eyes against the sunlight. The vehicle did not slow. It rolled directly toward the aircraft before stopping in a cloud of dust several yards away. The driver's door opened immediately. Colonel Richard Callahan stepped out. The reaction among the personnel was instant. Conversation stopped. Backs straightened. Several people snapped to attention. The colonel rarely appeared unannounced, and he certainly did not rush across the base for routine maintenance problems. Yet there he was, breathing slightly harder than usual, looking directly toward Walter Hayes. Captain Brooks immediately stepped forward. "Sir, we were not expecting." The colonel walked past him without stopping. The unfinished sentence vanished into the hot afternoon air. Every eye on the flight line followed him. Walter finally turned as the colonel approached. For the first time all day, a faint smile touched the old veteran's face. Not surprise. Recognition. The colonel stopped a few feet away. Neither man spoke immediately. The silence stretched across the runway. The technicians looked from one to the other, sensing something important but unable to understand it. Captain Brooks felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Then the colonel did something nobody expected. He extended his hand. "Walter." The old veteran accepted it. "Richard." More silence followed. The simplicity of the exchange somehow carried more weight than any speech. The colonel glanced toward the aircraft and then back toward Walter. "They called me and said your name appeared in the maintenance records." Walter nodded. "Apparently it still does." A faint smile crossed the colonel's face. He looked toward the aircraft with an expression that resembled respect more than ownership. "I have spent 15 years hearing stories about this airplane," he said quietly. "Every one of them seemed to include you." Captain Brooks stared. Several technicians exchanged stunned looks. Nobody had ever heard the colonel speak to anyone like that. Walter simply shrugged. The airplane did most of the work. The colonel laughed softly before turning toward the gathered personnel. His eyes settled on panel 7, then back to Walter. "Do you want to show them what they missed?" Walter Hayes looked at Colonel Callahan for a moment, then slowly nodded. The crowd parted without being asked. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody made jokes. The atmosphere that had filled the flight line that morning had vanished completely. Walter walked toward panel 7 with the steady confidence of a man returning to familiar ground. The aircraft remained silent above him, its gray surface warm beneath the afternoon sun. Captain Brooks watched closely, his earlier certainty replaced by uneasy curiosity. Walter stopped beside the panel and rested one weathered hand against the metal. For several seconds he did nothing. He simply looked, the same way he had been looking all day. Then he reached into his pocket and removed the old leather pouch. The worn brass snap clicked softly as it opened. From inside, he retrieved the small hand tool that had survived decades of service. A few technicians exchanged glances. The tool looked impossibly simple compared to the equipment surrounding them. Walter carefully loosened several fasteners and pulled the panel free. The crowd leaned forward. Behind the panel sat a series of connections and mounting brackets that appeared perfectly normal. Captain Brooks frowned. "Everything looks fine." Walter nodded. "That is the problem." He pointed toward a small alignment bracket mounted near the rear edge. The difference was almost invisible. A fraction of an inch. Easy to overlook. Impossible for software to question. Walter reached inside and gently adjusted the position. Several maintainers immediately stepped closer. One of them stared in disbelief. "That bracket is slightly offset." Walter nodded. "Just enough." Another technician shook his head. "The sensors would never catch that." "Exactly," Walter replied. "But the aircraft would." Silence followed. Nobody had an answer. Nobody argued. Walter secured the bracket, reattached the panel, and stepped back. Then he handed the tool to a stunned crew chief. "Now try again." Captain Brooks looked toward the maintenance team. For the first time all day, he did not sound completely sure of himself. "Run the startup sequence." The crew moved quickly. Switches were checked. Procedures were confirmed. A moment later, the startup process began. Everyone watched. Nobody spoke. The seconds stretched. Then a low mechanical hum emerged from deep inside the aircraft. Several heads lifted. The sound grew stronger. A heartbeat later, the engines came alive. The quiet runway filled with the unmistakable roar of power returning where silence had ruled all day. The sound rolled across the concrete and echoed through the warm Carolina air. Technicians froze. Airmen stared. Captain Brooks stood motionless. The aircraft that had defeated hours of diagnostics responded after a correction measured in fractions of an inch. Walter never celebrated. He never smiled. He simply watched the aircraft the way an old friend watches another old friend stand up after a difficult day. Colonel Callahan stepped forward beside him. The colonel's eyes remained on the aircraft for a long moment before turning toward the gathered personnel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said quietly, "you are looking at the reason this aircraft was never retired." Nobody spoke. The engines continued their steady roar in the background. Captain Brooks lowered his gaze. Around him, the maintenance crews stood in respectful silence. Walter Hayes slipped the old leather pouch back into his pocket and turned to leave. As he walked away, nobody tried to stop him. Nobody needed an explanation anymore. The lesson had already been learned. Some aircraft remember the people who kept them flying. And sometimes, so does everyone else.